It's nice to see everybody coming on the call. And I'm Joni Adamson. I'm the director of the Environmental Humanities Initiative, which is one of the sponsors for the distinguished lecture that we'll have on November 5th with Elizabeth Hoover, who is a noted food sovereignty and indigenous foodways expert. She's currently at Berkeley, and we're thrilled that we're going to have her. We're also thrilled that we have you all in the room, and we've had some really good turnouts for each one of the reading groups. And we want you to know that we have a research group, and these reading groups are meant to build capacity for our research group. So as I was just telling Stephanie Fitzgerald, who was able to join us this time, if you know of any students that are interested in these issues and you think they might be interested in becoming affiliated with our research group, please let them know, because this is going to be ongoing until 2023. My co-host is Joan McGregor, and Joan just waved. Do you want to introduce yourself really quickly?
Oh, okay. I'm Joan McGregor, professor of philosophy here on Tempe campus in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies. And yeah, I'm glad to see everybody here today.
Yeah, and as I said a minute ago, we've got a Mellon grant that will be funding a research group that will be ongoing through about 2023. So if any of your students are interested, please tell them to get in contact with us. We wanted to let everyone know that Elizabeth Hoover's lecture, her distinguished lecture for the Environmental Humanities Initiative, will be available for 1 week prior to November 5th. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to upload her 40-minute lecture and let it stream for a week, which means you, your students, whoever is interested can take their time at their own convenience to watch the 40-minute lecture. And then what we'll do is we'll welcome Elizabeth to the live event on November 5th, and it will be in a more conversational style. So we're going to have a bit of a conversation to begin with, and then we'll invite you guys to ask questions and send your questions through the chat or in advance, and then we'll have a really nice, warm conversation with Elizabeth Hoover. She was able to join us last time, so if any of you came last time, then you've already met her and know that she's just a fantastic person, and we're really lucky to have her. So we're really excited about today's topic, because what we wanted to do is we wanted to build on our two previous reading groups. The first one in which we talked about environmental humanities or humanities methodologies in relationship to food and food systems. And today, and then in the second one, we built on that. Again, Elizabeth herself joined us last time, and we talked about what the meaning of food sovereignty was as opposed to food insecurities or food security, and we had a really nice conversation last time. This time, we're going to sort of juxtapose several articles. We asked you to read an article on sugar ecologies, which was suggested to us by Hallie Eakin. And I found that essay to be really, really interesting. And then we asked you to read two shorter essays that sort of talked about the current status of COVID and food insecurities and hunger around the world. And actually, neither one of those was necessarily up to date. So those aren't necessarily the latest numbers, but they gave a sort of sense of the impact of COVID on the situation around the world. And then we asked you to read an article that I helped co-write, and that article sort of juxtaposes the notion of endemic, which was introduced in the Sugar Ecologies essay, with the notion of epidemic. So I really liked the juxtaposition of these two essays, because I had never thought of endemic as a slow-moving epidemic. I had never thought of that before. So I found that really, really helpful. And to think about epidemic as something that moves fast, and if it spreads wide enough, to become a pandemic. And in the article that I co-wrote with Stephen Hartman, we introduced this notion of syndemic, which is not a new note. It's not a new idea. In fact, it was introduced by Meryl Singer a number of years ago, but it had never been sort of talked about in terms of climate change or racism. And so we thought that the term syndemic was really evocative and powerful for thinking about a lot of things that come together all at once to sort of explode into what we would call the syndemic that we're experiencing right now. So environmental justice is a movement, which is, where I started my career, talking about environmental justice and talking about what the environmental justice movement is. Environmental justice has always made connections between colonization, racism, imperialism, toxic polluting industries cited in communities that lack political power, and just the whole history of trauma. And I'm really excited that Laura Tohi could join us this week. Thank you so much for coming, Laura, because Laura's writing has been really, really powerful and influential on my own thinking. She wrote a very short, well, she's written a lot, but she wrote a very short piece about Monument Valley, a little book about Monument Valley. And she talked about what happened with the Navajo and the Long Walk in her work. And so Laura, it's a blog that I published. And so I didn't actually cite your work, but in a longer piece that I've written, I actually cite your work and go into your work at actually great length. And, I've been really influenced to think about these long historical traumas that often involve interruption in the cultural meaning of food and the accessibility to food. And so we've had several of you send in really great questions that we're going to get to, but Laura, I don't know if you would you mind talking about the connections between the Long Walk and COVID-19 on the Navajo Nation?
Okay, first of all, hello everyone. I'm Professor Emerita from ASU, used to teach in the English department. I'm retired now, and so I'm a long-standing fan of the work that Joni has done throughout the years. So hello everyone. I grew up on the Navajo Nation homeland in Arizona and New Mexico. Then just to give you some historical information about this connection between food. In 1864, the Navajo people were forcibly removed from their homeland in parts of Arizona, what's now Arizona, New Mexico, and southern Utah. And one of the reasons that they were removed, it was believed that there was gold on the homeland. And so in order to prospect for gold, the Navajo people were removed. But it was also to take away the land, the resources, and have people move out of the way. It was part of this genocide era during that time period. So the Navajo people were removed beginning in 1864 and earlier. And one of the places that they were removed from was this place called what we called Sayet, and it's Canyon de Chelly on the maps. You might have been there or heard of it. There were families that lived down below in that canyon, and they were farmers. They grew their own food there. They had orchards, peach orchards, and other kinds of fruits that they grew down there. They lived off the land. They hunted deer, turkey, elk, and also they were very much grounded to that part of the world. That was what we call, they found agreement with this place. And also after the Spanish came, they introduced the sheep and the horses. So that became animals that the Navajo people took in and made their own. So sheep was pretty much an animal that the Navajo people relied on for food supply. So around 1864 and earlier, Kit Carson, who was a soldier, and it was under his leadership, was told to remove the Navajo people. So they were removed from Sayeh, Canyon de Chelly, and moved to this place called Fort Defiance. And it's by foot, it's probably 20 miles or so if you go on this road, maybe around that many miles. They were put there in Fort Defiance, which is really ironic. I was born there in Fort Defiance years later, but they were kept there. And then also they were other places where the Navajo people were rounded up and kept there. And then once the soldiers came to take all the Navajos that were part of the long walk to Fort Sumner. So the people left everything that they knew there. They couldn't take anything with them. Even their personal possessions they buried in places, thinking that at some point they would come back and they would be able to take, their pottery and jewelry and other valuable items that they had. And from that point on, our food changed dramatically. And when Navajo people were sent to Fort Sumner, new foods were introduced to them through the government. Foods that, that people in the rest of America were eating. Things like pork, and there was white flour, there was sugar, there was coffee, potatoes. Those were the foods that the Navajo people were given sometimes at this prison in Fort Sumner, which is in south central New Mexico, after they made this long walk, which is what it's called, a long walk from the homeland and the Navajo Nation homeland all the way into Fort Sumner. So they were kept there for 4 years. And it was the government's intent to keep the Navajo people there or send them on into Oklahoma, which is where a lot of the tribes ended up at that time, around that time period. So you have tribes from other parts of the country being sent to Oklahoma. And so it was discussed that the Navajo people would also maybe go there. But we signed later on, after 4 years in 1868, the Navajo people signed a treaty. But in the meantime, while they were there, they were expected to grow their own food using the water from this river. But the water was too brackish. It wasn't suitable for farming. The people nearly starved there. And I remember reading stories of some of the people having to dig through animal dung and to take out the undigested corn and eat that so that they wouldn't starve. They also didn't have a very good way to clothe themselves. And so they had to just rely on whatever they could. It's a horrible story, just a real horrible story of genocide. Women were shot or raped along the way to this prison camp. And once they got there, they didn't have shelter. So they had to do the best they could to put together some sort of shelter. But when they got food, sometimes the food that they got, like the pork, bacon, it would be rancid. So it was inedible. And the Navajo people really didn't know what this food was about. And remember, my grandmother was telling me that she'd heard these oral stories that they were given potatoes, and the Navajo people didn't know what to do with potatoes. And so they just sort of threw them at each other, because no one taught them how to cook it. They were also introduced to coffee, and they didn't know how to, prepare these foods. So that was another reason why they almost starved. But from that period, after that, when they went back to the homeland, they had to start all over again. And they probably brought some of these foods back with them, and our diet changed considerably after that. And now we have all the foods that were brought from Fort Sumner. We have white flour, sugar, coffee, and everything. And we also have fast food on our homeland too. And so you can imagine these kinds of foods, what they do to the body, especially to a body that didn't have that, were not introduced, the body was not introduced to those kinds of foods. So you can imagine we have high rates of diabetes, obesity, cancer. My brother, just ahead of me, died last December from stomach cancer. So then I had a grandmother also passing away from that. So all these kind of foods were introduced, and now they are actually part of our diet. And I remember last summer I went to the grocery store, a little grocery store outside of Gallup, which is right near the Navajo Reservation homeland. And right in this grocery store, there was like a huge aisle of foods that they know Navajo people would buy. So they had set out lard, white flour, sodas, I think Spam. So this was like the food that most of the Navajo people eat today, unfortunately. And so that was all set out for them because Navajo people would buy those in huge quantities, either for themselves or they would have ceremonies and cook these foods at the ceremonies. So and now we have fried bread. Fried bread is not a traditional food for Native people. All this was introduced through, the settler colonizers' diet. So that's pretty much just sort of a history of how our food diet changed. And today we don't have the kind of farming we used to do. My mother used to have a farm, and she used to try to grow her own corn and squash and melons. My mother passed away. So I think what's happening today is there are younger people like my nephew who have planted a cornfield. And I think the younger generation are trying to keep these farming and agricultural traditions alive. So some of them have been doing that, but for the most part, we're still relying on the fast food because it's cheap, right? So if you don't have a lot of money, you can just go to the fast food place and pick up, whatever is on sale there. So I think that the Navajo people, for one thing, there have been some attempt to change the Navajo diet by some of the health people, like from the hospitals and nurses, and that go out into the community and try to teach about some of these foods. But for the most part, because people are so poor, and now with the pandemic, people have been laid off, there's less money for food. And so there is, I just want to say, what's happened now during this pandemic is there has been food distribution being given out to some of the remote communities, and healthy foods like vegetables and fruits, and that kind of food has been being distributed to the Navajo people. So we are in a transition now. I think that we have to, as a Native person, as a Navajo person, I think we have to look at our food source. And I think this is one thing that the pandemic is telling us, is that what are the foods have we been eating, what have they been doing to our bodies, and how can we revitalize our traditional foods. So that's pretty much what's happening.
Thank you so much, Laura. I've been reading Laura's work for years. And so when, we began reading that Indigenous people in general and Navajo people specifically were 8 times more likely to get COVID you know, I guess I was sort of prepared to sort of, you know, deal with a concept that you might call syndemic, which is, you know, these people are more vulnerable, more at risk because oftentimes they don't have, you know, access to electricity and water. And then there's this whole historic trauma of what happened from the long walk forward to today when, you know, I think I said there's only 13 grocery stores for this huge, huge nation. We thought today one of the things we might do, Crystal, if you don't mind, is check in with Crystal Franco, who is working on the O'odham Nation down around Ajo. And would you mind, Crystal, telling us what's going on there?
Hi.
Hi.
Good place. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I'm still at work. And so there's different meetings happening in different areas of the building. Here I work for the Ajo Center for Sustainable Agriculture. And prior to COVID-19, I was in the hiring process. And so I was going to be doing a very different position out here. But then the pandemic hit. And so with me transitioning here, first I came as a volunteer for a few weeks, and maybe that was in the 5th week of COVID-19 and their emergency food distribution. And then I was already moved down here by the 2nd month of the pandemic. And so if you don't know where Ajo is, it's literally in the middle of the Sonoran Desert. We're 2 hours south of Phoenix and 2 hours west of Tucson on the west side of the O'odham Nation. And we have one grocery store out here. And then the next closest grocery store is about 60 miles. That would be in Sells, like on the middle of the O'odham Reservation. And so our one grocery store got, you know, completely wiped out with all the emergency food buying. And so you literally had to have a car and had to be able to drive, you know, an hour away to get any food. And so with the Ajo CSA, part of the nonprofit umbrella is that they were running a restaurant. And so they were able to buy bulk food through the restaurant supply chain. And because restaurants had closed down, there was a lot more food available in the restaurant supply chain. And we're a commercial kitchen, so we were able to buy, you know, 50-pound bags of lentils and rice and oats, and then break them down into 1-pound bags, and then create our own food bags to distribute on the reservation and here in Ajo and the other tiny towns surrounding Ajo. And we have people who, you know, because of poverty, they live out of their vans, like on the federal land, because it's BLM land. So we have like a lot of, how do you say, like transient people who choose to live out on the land. And so we're also feeding that population as well.
Oh, thank you. Since the articles that we read for today were, it may be written in May, but you know, an article written in May is already sort of outdated for COVID. We just thought it would be interesting just to hear what's going on on the O'odham Nation and just around the nation in general. Some of you sent us some great questions, and I think what we'll do is we'll start off with Delaney. Delaney, do you want to ask your great question? And after that, everybody just please feel free to just ask any questions you have, and let's just talk with each other. So Delaney, thanks a lot for asking a first question.
Sure. I have it was a very long question of just sorting through things. So the specific text in which I'm referring to, for anyone who, we've all read them, but anyone who wants to specifically look there, is the sugar ecologies. And I think, as I imagine many of us were, I think I was very disturbed by the specific example that it provided regarding where research funds were going versus what the practitioners themselves kind of knew the better solution, I suppose, in the terms of the dentist that were cited. And so it was the NCP's research on sugar that it's kind of this Band-Aid fix. And it's, in my eyes, very reactive, not very proactive, not an attempt to understand both the histories, but also any sort of sustainable long-term, like it doesn't understand, it fails to kind of recognize the consequences long-term. And I think that this is a specific example with the dentist, but perhaps research going on in other areas as well. So my questions out of this are, as many of our conversations have kind of gone, and the way that I wrote it is, we have food either being kind of calories or being nutrition. And I think these calories are very cheap. We can get food, we can get calories, but very cheap, and that becomes attractive because economically it's cheap, it works. So I think just how do we tap into kind of break that cycle? And then the last piece is just, who are the leaders taking the responsibility to do so, without shaming people for their food choices. When there's fast food available in areas that may have less access, or if there's grocery stores that aren't providing healthy options, that can also become very personal. So I think there's just a big pile of thought that my question serves to try and delve into.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody wants to just sort of jump in and start taking Delaney's questions apart and sort of answering them, or attempt. I don't know. They're big questions. Yeah, go, Sarah.
So one challenge with this system is that you're dealing with an industrialized agriculture food system that is highly subsidized. And so there are specific choices that have been put in certain crops, like beets and corn, to be mass produced, and they get subsidized. And the larger farms have been, over the years, been pushed to grow and become larger, so that this becomes a commodity that is so cheap. And so once it's there, it needs to be sold, and it gets sold all over. So it gets sold to the poorer communities, but it also gets sold overseas. So as an Egyptian, we've been getting a lot of subsidized, cheap USAID kind of foods throughout the past 100 years or so. Because this food got created, it needs to be sold, basically. And so it's a vicious cycle of an industrialized food agriculture, food system that needs to be perpetuated, because that's how the economy keeps rolling. And so the challenge, I think, becomes all these alternatives, indigenous communities that are trying to establish themselves. Their scale is not big enough. And so it always ends up being that this other alternative product is much more expensive, because it doesn't have that big infrastructure of subsidies and lobbying and support that the industrial one does. It's a priority. That's what different governments have prioritized, basically.
Good points, Sarah. I wanted to pick up a little bit too on, and maybe this is, all the comments, starting with, Laura's on, the effect of the Long March, or the effect of, and I think we're seeing this in other communities, sort of systematic racism over generations, but certainly with Native populations where you have generations of, trauma, right? I mean, the Long March, but also just, all the effects of, boarding schools and so on, and how that affects, somebody's, and I think this is what's interesting, is sort of like affects somebody's physiology. And I take it that's sort of what was Joni's article about the syndemic is that it's, and you see this in the African American community as well, is just, why is it they're more susceptible to certain diseases? Well, stress, living in a stressful environment, and then of course you add all the other things like the food, the food issues, makes you more prone to getting sick, and having various diseases and disabilities. That's why I feel like this idea of a syndemic, of sort of seeing as, there's not one silver bullet, although, Sarah, I think your point of, we need to stop subsidizing bad food, but we also need to, disentangle some of these things. Tess, who's joining us from Australia, this is what's wonderful about Zoom, was saying, some of this is resonating with things that are happening in Australia. And I think this idea of, historical trauma, until we face up to, our history, and that's where, the idea of truth and truth telling, and she mentioned that in her chat, and I thought, that's something about, when Laura tells us this story about the Navajos, I don't think a lot of people know that story. I mean, Kit Carson has been, glamorized as a hero, right? I don't think they know that story about him. I don't know what they know about him. But I mean, the point is, until we actually can kind of acknowledge this and tell the truth, I feel like the trauma is going to be there, right? And so that plays into the food, and all these other things kind of seem like they're playing into each other. Anyway, my 2 cents worth.
I think that, that as tribal nations, I think we also have to step up and take some responsibility to change our diets, to look at, what's happening to our bodies, what's happening to our people. I mean, you can imagine, how, because of poverty, obesity, lack of fresh water nearby, lack of adequate medical facilities nearby, all of this is, I grew up with that. We had to drive from Crystal, New Mexico to Gallup, which is about an hour and a half drive, maybe even longer before there was a highway put in. And sometimes we couldn't always make it because the roads were not paved, that we'd run into muddy roads. And so this is something that, we've grown up with, many of us from my generation. And I think sometimes we tended to become complacent and just accept it as this is the way it is, and without ever trying to maybe make changes. And so I think the tribal nations and the leadership have to step in and do something more about how our things like food supply, for one thing, and water, of course, because I remember we had to go to the well and get water, which is from my grandmother's house. It was about 2 miles away. It wasn't that far. But other people had to go even farther than that, and you bring the water home like that. That's still happening today. People are still having to take these huge plastic barrels and drive to the water supply and bring it home so that they can have water. So water became very precious, you couldn't play with water. We were always told, you don't play with water, you treat it like it's, it's sacred, which, it was, because we only used it for cooking and washing our hands, and then maybe we'd wash our hair maybe once a week or something like that. But, I'm just wanting to, I think that we need, as Native peoples, we need to get our tribal leadership involved more in this food sovereignty, what it is and what it's doing to our nation. And, because it can't be just left up for the outside world. When I grew up, the nearest town, like I said, was Gallup, New Mexico. And I've shopped there. There are a few grocery stores there, and I don't think I've ever seen any organic food being sold in any of the grocery stores. And I don't know how many older Navajo people know about these kinds of foods that are available. And so, I think there has to be some kind of more, a word has to be spread out to, and somehow Navajo people, I think, have to be educated to make better food choices. And also it has to be from the businesses, because because of the poverty, people will buy, of course, the cheapest thing. People, so there's that factor involved in this. So it's going to be a major effort to try to, change things and try to bring more food sources out to the reservation, and I remember my grandfather, Peterson Zaw, he used to work at ASU, and he said he put out a call for grocery stores for the Navajo Nation. And the idea was to bring these grocery stores onto the reservation so people wouldn't have to drive so far. He said the only grocery chain that responded was Bashas'. And so there are several Bashas' on the reservation. But he said no one else responded, so they gave the contract to Bashas'. So, I'm just saying this from my perspective, is that, we need to, from the inside, we need to work to change things for ourselves, for our communities, and, for the next generations too.
So, Laura, I never knew that your grandfather was Peterson Zaw. Wow.
Well, he's my clan grandfather, so I have many clan grandfathers.
Ooh, you come from a famous family. So it's not surprising that you also are such a well-known writer. I was going to say that, Eddie Basha was kind of amazing in that he did use his grocery store profits to benefit education. He was, I don't know if you ever have noticed, but if you walk around ASU, all of our campuses, there'll be some plaque somewhere that says donated by the Bashas' family, or, the Bashas' gave money for this building. And if you go into, what's that old building on our campus called? I can't even remember. I'm having a brain freeze here. The one where we have all the events.
Old Main.
Yeah, if you go up on Old Main, and then the second floor, there's the Bashas' room. It's got a really racist painting all around the room, but other than that, it's got a plaque in there from the Bashas'. So maybe that sort of begins to get at what Sarah was just saying about how there are corporate choices, policy choices, and we have to work at changing those kinds of things at a structural, infrastructural level. And I do think the Bashas' have sort of tried to have an impact in that arena. But I also wanted to sort of say, and this is just, speaking to Delaney's question about, how are we going to change this, that one of the things that we're talking about doing in our research group is, possibly thinking about how we might take, and Sally, this will sort of link to your work in the humanities labs, thinking about how we might take culinary institutes or humanities labs on the road, maybe to places that need to be educated, as Laura was saying, but more than that, having really innovative chefs, maybe indigenous chefs, come back to ASU and talk to us about how they are, revivifying their food system. So, Crystal, you probably know about TOCA, the Tohono O'odham Community Alliance, and the big food sort of system revivification that they've been doing for years now. But I've been really inspired by TOCA, the Tohono O'odham Community Alliance, and the way they've gotten grants from the Ford Foundation and whatnot to reintroduce traditional foods to specifically to elders that have diabetes. So yeah, if you stay with us and join us for this food group, one of the things we're sort of talking about is how might that work? Traveling humanities labs, traveling culinary institutes, going both ways, you know, to communities that might need education, but also from communities to the cities. And Joan's been really good at making sure that we know who all the sort of latest, youngest Indigenous chefs are. And she brought some of those people into our Dinner 2040 project. I don't know if you want to talk about that, Joan.
Well, and I'm sure many of you know there's some great Indigenous chefs out there across the country doing some great work. And of course, because food isn't just food, it really is culture and tying people to their traditions. And so, you know, I think that's kind of what this has been about, is not, I mean, food is a great way in on, you know, cultural traditions. And so, yeah, so we've been thinking about this idea of, you know, how we might, you know, see, you know, food as a way in on all these other humanities themes about, you know, and of course I'm a philosopher. I like to think about the moral values around the food system, you know, preserving, you know, not only food justice, but also preserving our land, you know, and other values around food. But of course, there's all sorts of other, you know, traditions around food, you know, thinking of stories we tell, you know, cultural stories people tell. And so part of what Joni and I have been throwing around with Melissa Nelson, who's not here today, is just, you know, maybe how we could develop a kind of a humanities lab, but take it on the road around food and connect up with chefs in communities. Or, you know, you don't have to be a famous chef. You can be just somebody who's interested in food traditions and try to bring in, you know, students, and partly see that as a way that they might get connected up with higher education too, because we have a real problem here in Arizona. As you know, you may or may not know, that most kids that go out of high school don't go on to college. They don't see themselves in college. They don't see anything there for them. And so one of the ideas we had is seeing food as something that some kid, you know, maybe in some remote place might see, oh, you know, I'm interested in this. And I actually got this idea, I think, from, I don't know if some of you are familiar with Freddie Batsui, who's a Navajo chef, who's now the chef at, runs the restaurant at the Native American Museum in Washington, D.C. But he told me this story that he went to University of New Mexico and was studying cultural anthropology. And then he started seeing, well, wait a minute, this actually connects up with my food traditions from the Navajo Nation. And then he, you know, kind of, I don't know if he dropped out or just started thinking about food in relationship to cultural anthropology. And anyway, now he's, long story short, but now he's a well-known chef, and of course, probably in the best place. He's and at that museum, if you ever go to the restaurant there, he brings in all products from Native nations, and the foods he cooks are, you know, foods from different parts of the you know, or, you know, not that he does all the cooking himself, but he's kind of the lead guy. But that's what they're trying to do, is showcase to people that there's a lot of really great culinary traditions around the country, very different ones, right? I mean, you know, the tribes from Minnesota are very different from the Southwest, but there's still really rich traditions of food there. So that's kind of our brainstorming idea. We'll see if it goes anywhere, but yeah, we need to get a lot of you guys involved.
We need funding.
Well, that too. We're used to doing things on a shoestring. Yeah, Sarah, you want to jump in?
Yeah, this just made me think that, so this is on one level, like the university linkage, but I also think that one thing that needs to be somehow supported is the work that's happening on different reservations in different communities. So we've heard from Crystal about the work that Ajo CSA is doing, but then you have places like Indibikia, who have in Western Apache, where White River, they have not only created this pantry, which has all sorts of indigenous foods there, but they're teaching farming and traditional ways of processing corn and things like this. And they have applied for the Double Up SNAP program. So people in the communities can come and take their products, the indigenous products like Ramona, things that they're also getting from all over, like Ramona Farms, for convenient prices. Because the issue is also, yes, the chefs do play an important role for sure in making things accessible and known to people, but I also think that it needs to be within communities and accessible on people's kind of lands. I also like the work that Shane Burnett has done with the bus, which travels around and teaches about indigenous food practices. On that thought, there's also, and probably Laura, you are familiar with it, but there's a really good report that was done by the Dene Food Policy Group on recommendations of what Dene food sovereignty should look like. And it's a very comprehensive report that has been compiled with a lot of history on, first of all, how Dene view their food sovereignty and what that means, what food means to them, and then linking that to some of the challenges that exist, like you talked about, access, distances and things like that, and then some of the solutions that actually are locally attuned and make sense. I highly recommend this report. That's it.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I want to jump in about the idea of the traveling lab. One of the themes of this, our readings today, is how everything is interconnected with everything else, and how issues that tend to get isolated from one another, like, say, for example, somebody might say diabetes among Navajos in the Navajo Nation, are really so interconnected with other aspects, not only of problems that we're having, like climate change and environmental degradation, and the pandemic having been released through these changed conditions. And so one of the things that we're learning is the inequities in access not only to water and electricity and things that most Americans regard as the necessities of life, but also to information. And so the traveling idea, although we might think we could solve it via internet connections, isn't really solvable that way, because all of these crises are so interconnected, and the lack of access not only to food, but to information about food. And I thought Laura's story about her family and the history of the Navajo people and how the diet changed through these coercive practices and now has become the diet. It's very important to unravel some of that so that there's more clarity about how we got to be where we are at this minute. And one of the things Humanities Labs do, as many of you on this call know, is interconnect these things across disciplines and across historical time periods, and trying to see those connections. So I really like the idea of thinking about how also to engage local people in any place this traveling might occur, to teach us, so that the process is a mutual information process, because there's a lot of knowledge and insight that we need to understand and needs to be disseminated more broadly. So maybe there's a Kellogg grant in this, or a Mellon. And I'm also thinking this is, I hope not too private a message to Joni, but Dinner 2040 could take on many aspects, many little clicks of the dial, not only just thinking about future availability and climate impact on foods and also all the values and the other things that we consider there, but also in different you know, involving completely different populations about what that would all mean. So as we think about that, it might behoove us to think about the different locations where how that would change.
Yeah, that was our melon pitch, but we were not forwarded. So,
No, no,
so,
but maybe it just didn't match this particular
yeah.
Yeah.
call. I mean, I think there may be other ways in.
So we will continue. And I think, Julianne, are you teaching a food lab next semester?
No, I'm not teaching a food lab next semester, but I did have a comment I wanted to make about CSAs, and Crystal's work with her CSA reminded me that CSAs all over the state are just increasing their subscriptions by incredible rates. I mean, some are increasing subscriptions by over 250%. But I think this is a moment we should seize, because many people are becoming more aware of the weaknesses of our current food system and a lack of resilience, and they're looking for alternatives. And the CSAs is a way to support local farmers, but it's also a way to educate. And I think it would work perfectly. A network of CSAs in both tribal communities and also outside of tribal communities would be a great way to facilitate those kind of humanities labs.
That's a great idea.
I'm helping
Yeah.
to organize. And a related issue I wanted to bring up is that, because I found out more about it being involved with the CSA. So we're involved with Sun Produce, is a cooperative of 10 local farms. And through our collaboration, I've just learned about the plight of farmers in Maricopa County. That they're very productive, they're doing very well, but most of them lease their land. And we've lost, in Maricopa County, we've lost 24% of our farmland between 2012 and 2017. So if we don't help them, if we don't sustain them, we're not going to have CSAs. And so I think that needs to be a priority for everyone involved in food studies at ASU.
That's a good point. Yeah, no, I think it's, and one of the problems too with COVID was that a lot of the small farmers, their supply chain was to restaurants, local restaurants. And so once the local restaurants shut, which, you know, still many of them are still shuttered, they lost that supply chain. And it was you know, we don't have a good way of just shifting grounds quickly. But so, you know,
a lot of them are still productive because of are doing pretty well because of CSAs, but and other, you know, supply chains that have developed, but they're losing their land because most of them lease land.
Yeah.
And they're losing their land to developers. And also, for instance, Crooked Sky Farms, which is he's the farmer Frank is the son of an indigenous farm worker. He's a very productive farmer, but he's going to lose his land to a sewage facility. So I think we really have to focus on a farm trust and protecting local farmers so that we can offer alternatives.
I was just in a meeting this morning, and a couple of people here were part of Slow Food Phoenix, and talking to some of the slow food around in the Southwest. And speaking of CSAs, and this may be something I want to get ours involved in, is raising funds to buy CSAs for senior citizens. And talking, you know, with Laura, talking about some of the older people maybe don't know the value of kind of organic food, or, you know, it's just, and it's expensive, you know, it can be expensive, but just the idea of raising money and just giving people CSAs, you know, so that they get this steady stream of good food. So anyway, maybe that's not for this group to be fundraising, but, you know, just another issue to think about. I think it would help farmers, and it would certainly help senior citizens who don't have the funds to participate in a CSA. So. So there's a lot going on in the chat, so I know you guys are thinking about these things.
Thank you. I was just going to say that I hope that in my own article that maybe a piece that might stand out, or if you didn't notice it, is that we were sort of trying to think about what would transition the humanities, or cultural studies, from a community of interest to a community of purpose. And I think that's what we're talking about here. How do we, as students, as scholars, as faculty, as humanists or social scientists, how do we transition from researchers who are interested in something or researching something into a community of purpose? So I really liked your suggestion, Julianne, that we would tie our traveling culinary institutes or our traveling humanities labs to a CSA, or to the work of a CSA in a place. That's a really great idea, but also sort of would illustrate how we would move from being a community of interest to a community of purpose. I just like that idea a lot.
It's a busy time of the semester. Well, COVID has raised, I think, one hopeful thing maybe is just the idea that that with the COVID crisis, that and recognizing the kind of dangers in our food system, that we might see something new come out afterwards, right? I mean, that people sort of acknowledge that we, it's a pretty fragile system that can break down. And so the idea of, purchasing from local farmers and making sure your farmers are still able to survive becomes more important once you start to see how, fragile, even how crappy the food is, but it's a fragile global system. So, yeah.
Oh, going off of what Joni just said, the transforming from a community of interest to purpose, I think that was sort of a lot of what I was thinking about when reading and being interested in these ideas. Okay, but what do I do as an individual? I think there is talk about higher level systemic change, and I think individuals do play a role in helping to lead that and helping to change policy. But I think something that I always reflect on personally, in addition to that, is what action can an individual take, like in the here and now, to start and hack at those ideas, not waiting for policy to change, not waiting for higher ups, and all of that. And beyond that, I guess I would really like to talk about what education on healthy food, we could replace that word with many things, what education on food would look like, because more like maybe people could say green foods are good and things in packages are bad, but simply changing the education but not changing the ability to access, like, to what degree is that helping change the choices that those people can make when quite literally the finances or the geography could be an inhibitor. One area I go to is teaching people how to farm, teaching people how to grow their own food. To what degree does that place my own bias upon people? Because I love being in the soil, but maybe people don't have time for that. Maybe people don't like that. So I guess I'm throwing out different ideas here, but what would the education look like? I guess I'll just, what would some sort of education look like?
Anyone want to answer that? It's interesting. I mean, to me, I always think when I was growing up, my grandparents all had gardens in their yard, food gardens. Partly it was the era of, in the First and Second World War, people all had these, they called them victory gardens for, the idea that as part of the war effort, you would grow your own food. And so kind of everybody had that knowledge, right? And then of course we've moved away from that. So it is interesting. I mean, I always think people know what good food is, but there are a lot of people, and a lot of people grew up, eating processed food, and and now we're maybe 2 or 3 generations along with that. So there is a kind of learning curve there. So yeah, I mean, it's not as simple as it probably sounds.
I'd like to jump, not like I have a vision for what education should be, but I just was very, I don't know, sad after reading all the articles. It's, I was thinking about COVID and how it impacted the food system, and of course, it kind of brought to front the most necessities of our lives. What we prioritize mostly in our lives, and what we take for granted. So COVID kind of highlighted these things. I was thinking a lot about my privileged life during the COVID, that I have a house as a shelter, have job to pay bills and buy food and a car, and a lot of people who don't have those type of privileges in the protection in this time. And maybe it's not seem to be relative, but looking at our campus and new buildings in Tempe rising up, and we sitting working from home. I took class about history, environmental history, and we look at the map of this area, and it was a rural area. It was a farming land. I mean, of course, before was campus, but after colonizing those lands, it was a farming land there. And maybe being a practitioner, humanist, maybe we could bring some places back to life as a farming type of places where you can live those lives as your parents lived, John, to have a garden and spend the breaks there and appreciate the connections to the land instead of in these jungles of the I mean, it's all utopian kind of vision, but this is sort of what I was thinking. We talk about very important things, and we see what's happening around us. And I really see this moment as a humanities moment, as taking the leadership in this in those situations. It really shown how the system is failing, and it's failing because humanities was not really sort of a leader, not because humanists didn't want to, but it just what it is. Yeah, so this is kind of like thought I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina.
Yeah. Would others like to jump in? Talk about what you think what has COVID done for our food system, or where we're going, where we ought to go?
It looks like maybe Yonan has a comment.
Yeah, I'm wondering if gardening is enough for solving the food problems, or should we placing more important in the education about our food choices, that what food is good for our body. And yeah, because if consumers don't want to eat so much snacks and beverages, even though there are many different types of them. So maybe the companies the corporations don't have the motivation to produce so much junk food. And yeah.
That's a really good point. And I actually think Delaney was sort of suggesting that earlier when she said she likes to garden, she likes to get dirt under her fingernails, but she knows that not everybody likes that. So what you're pointing out, Yanan, is that education is really important, because it's probably the case that most people, I mean, they say by 2050, I think, or 2080, something like 80% of the world will live in urban places. So education is going to be key to, what will that look like? How will we get our food? Will it be shipped in from somewhere else? Will we be producing it hydroponically, in buildings, in high rises? Will we be gardening on high rise roofs, that kind of thing? So that's a really good question. I don't know if anybody here has answers to the question she just asked.
I'm thinking it was 2011. I was involved in a project where we would garden in funky places, essentially. And it was a project for kids that was nationwide called Truck Farm. And essentially we were teaching kids to, by way of planting our own truck beds, we were encouraging them to plant in whatever they had. So we challenged them to show us something like a cut open basketball or whatever, and tell them to garden in whatever they had. And it was geared towards hyper urban children living in hyper urban places. But our underlying message that we were very vocal about was that we didn't want anyone to think this was the panacea for having food. We wanted them to know that we were just telling them that they could grow food anywhere they possibly could, whether that was a container garden sitting on their small windowsill in a high rise, or basketball or whatever it was. But that was the point, was that you could grow food anywhere with whatever you have. And like you said, maybe it was a vertical garden somewhere or whatever, but we wanted people to know that they could grow food. And again, that it wasn't the panacea for food security or anything, insecurity or anything like that, but that was our objective. And I think the idea, though elementary, is very actually applicable to grown adults of all ages, because what it does obviously is very obviously teaches adults to grow, but at the same time, I think something that's missing in the equation is taste education. And I think that, there's actually 2 or 3 decades of us now, if not more, who've grown up without understanding what it's like to just love eating an apple. And I think all of us here probably know it's because the taste of an apple has gone away, or a tomato, or whatever the food is. But even the worst apples, we can try to sort of cook in a certain way or whatever to reestablish those tastes. I always tell people, I think some of you even here have heard me say that I grew up on steamed broccoli when I was a kid, but my grandmother used to put peanut sauce made from like bami, because she was Indonesian, so it was like a super spiced peanut sauce, just right over the top of it. And for all intents and purposes, I probably shouldn't have liked it because it was boiled broccoli, but because there was peanut sauce on it, I acquired a taste for broccoli, and to this day it's my favorite vegetable. And of course there's a little bit of wiring there because I adapted that taste as a child, but I think I know I've seen this happen to adults too, even in their adult lifetime. So I think what I'm boiling this down to is that, you know, doing these little fun challenges or things like that, whether it's with children or adults, whether it's growing or taste, but particularly taste, because I think that's really, really missing from the equation in teaching adults and children how to get back to our roots. Because once we love the taste, we want to understand more about where our food comes from and what's happening with it. Or at least that's a philosophy I tend to abide by. But I think those two things are key in that equation. And with regard to COVID, I think Arena is really right on track in that this is a great time to revisit, not necessarily that we all have the time right now, but some people do have more time than they've had or are re-examining their priorities. And I think this is a good time to think about projects and challenges and fun things like that. So just my 2 cents.
Good. That's good. Yeah, no, I mean, you know, there isn't a silver bullet, right? There's not one thing we can do, but there's kind of multiple things. I always think, like, how did we get here? You know, we got here over a course of, you know, 50 years. I mean, to the industrialized food system of the United States, and sort of like, you know, we can get somewhere else, right? We're not stuck here.
Yeah, that's a good point. I remember when I was in junior high that the big news was that they were building a McDonald's. You know, it was the first McDonald's in our town. And, you know, now when I think about that, I just think, wow, that this has happened in my lifetime. And humans, when you think about deep time or geological time, we don't live that long. So if this can all happen in one lifetime, right, good point. We could change it back in another lifetime. So that might be, you know, a generation of, you know, the next generation. Hopefully we can change it back or change it.
Other thoughts, or anybody in the throes of midterms and all the other stuff that's going on?
Well, I just will throw out, I love what you said about taste education, Natalie. That is so important because, you know, in the McDonald's lifetime, essentially what we were being educated to like was sugar. So the Sugar Ecologies essay speaks really well to the way in which people are literally educated to like something, and then they purchase it in the form of a soda, and then they pay for it later again in the form of health disparities or health problems. But we were educated to like sugar. So I don't know if any of you have had the experience of then taking sugar out of your diet. And then you taste it again and you don't even like it anymore. So literally we were educated to like sugar. And so, yeah, in this next generation or a lifetime, if we manage to transition, I think taste education is going to be key. And I want to taste your grandma's peanut sauce.
Yeah.
I can give you the recipe, Joni.
Oh, would you really? I would love that. Yes, I would love that. Thank you.
It's not, I'm just going to tell you right now, it's very Americanized. When she migrated here, she very much, and that's a whole interesting story in itself, but it very much became Americanized. But I'll give it to you anyway.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to really love that.
I grew up in Soviet time, so this was a different experience with sugar. It was portion control. It's strict. Even you love it, you kind of understand the responsibility out of necessity that you eat a certain amount. And this is associated with feast and celebration moments. And I think it's probably in many cultures. It's why then people going through trauma, even unconsciously getting maybe more sort of, I don't know, addicted and all. to to sugar or some other things, because it's becoming the coping mechanism to bring the moments of happiness back to life. And so when I was reading about the sugar ecology, I was thinking about similarities between indigenous people who went through this long walk and lost everything, and African American people who were slaves and also were.
One of your brain.
Sorry. So it's a lot of similarities in the maybe this favorite sugar taste is also part of the coping mechanism to the trauma they went through. This kind of thoughts I had.
Okay, well, maybe we ought to just get ready for our next iteration of this, and that's we're going to be listening. We'll be sending out messages about Elizabeth Hoover's talk, and we hope you'll get a chance to watch it ahead of time and then show up on November 5th when we'll have a chance to engage her and about her thinking and about her talk, and she's done a lot of work, of course, with Indigenous food systems, so we're really delighted to be able to have her. But we've been just learning so much over this last few weeks, I guess. We really read a lot of interesting things, and this today was terrific, and it was so great to have both Laura and Crystal talk about some of their experiences here in different parts of the state. And we had some lots of chats going. I'm going to read the chats later, but I'm going to jump out. I've got another meeting that I'm directing, so I'm going to go get into another Zoom meeting. But anyway,
Thanks, Joan.
Yeah, excited you guys could all come. So I'm going to jump out of this. And
Okay. All right. Thank you. Well, so I'll just follow up by saying thank you to everyone, and we'll be preparing. We'll let you know about Elizabeth Hoover's lecture when it goes up and where we're streaming it. And for any of you who may want to get access to the chat or anything that we did in any of these reading groups, just let us know, because we've been recording them. And we're going to try to turn them into videos/podcasts. And again, keep track of everything we did in the research group so that you guys have access to it later. So thank you so much for coming.